In downtown Chicago's bustling River North District, a young documentary filmmaker was about to stand her ground. A routine lunch hour turned deadly when a volatile internet provocateur began dragging her across the sidewalk by her hair. Stephen, Seagal wasn't your typical bystander. For decades, he was a decorated martial artist and law enforcement trainer, known for neutralizing threats with surgical precision and unshakable control. When Tyrell T-Rex Monroe escalated his assault in broad daylight, he had no idea he was facing a man who'd once taught elite operators how to diffuse chaos without ego. Stephen stepped forward with measured calm, initiating a quiet response that would ignite a cultural firestorm. What began as a brutal act of street harassment would become a masterclass in restraint and moral clarity. The streets of Chicago would never be the same after one man's decision to intervene not with violence, but with absolute presence. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The midday sun beat down on Chicago's River North District, turning the bustling sidewalks into a symphony of urban life. Street vendors called out their daily specials while car horns punctuated conversations, and pedestrians weaved through the concrete ballet, some rushing toward deadlines, others lingering at colorful storefronts. The air carried the mingled sense of asphalt, exotic spices, and endless possibility. Zoe Martinez adjusted her camera strap and wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead as she approached Mrs. Radha Patel's flower stall. The elderly woman's weathered hands arranged vibrant bouquets with practiced precision, her sari catching the light like a jewel against the urban backdrop. This was exactly the kind of resilience Zoe wanted to capture for her documentary, Immigrants, Building Beauty in the Heart of America's Grittiest Cities. Mrs. Patel, could you tell me about your morning routine? Zoe asked, her voice warm and encouraging as she positioned her camera. How do you decide which flowers to feature each day? The older woman's eyes crinkled with genuine pleasure. Oh, Beta, every day I wake up at 4 in the morning. I go to the wholesale market and I feel the flowers, not just look, but feel. The roses, they tell me if they are ready for love stories. The daisies, they whisper about new beginnings. Her accent carried the musical cadence of her homeland, but her words were clear and purposeful. 20 feet away, Deshaun Dice Reed flipped a hot dog on his small grill, the sizzle harmonizing with the street's natural rhythm. His cart, painted in bold reds and yellows with Dice's dogs emblazoned across the side, had become a neighborhood institution. He caught Zoe's eye and winked, his gold tooth glinting in the sunlight. You getting the good stuff today, college girl? Dice called out, his voice carrying the easy confidence of someone who'd claimed this corner as his own. Mrs. P's got stories that'll make your professors cry. Zoe laughed, lowering her camera momentarily. That's exactly what I'm hoping for. Real stories, not just pretty pictures. At Dice's feet, Milo, a rescued pit bull with gentle brown eyes and a coat the color of burnished copper, dozed in whatever shade the cart provided. Occasionally, his ears would twitch at the sound of pigeons landing nearby, but he remained. The picture of contentment, his massive head resting on his paws. Marco Lee had set up his easel near the intersection, his skilled hands working quickly to capture the likenesses of tourists and office workers on their lunch breaks. His sketches possessed a raw energy that transformed ordinary faces into something memorable. He glanced up occasionally, his artist's eye cataloging the scene. The way shadows fell across the pavement, how people moved through space, the subtle hierarchies of street life. Business good today? Zoe asked, panning her camera to include Marco's work. Always something interesting happening around here, Marco replied, his pencil never stopping its dance across paper. You just gotta know how to look. That's when Tyrell T-Rex Monroe made his entrance. He strolled down the sidewalk like he owned not just the pavement, but the air above it, his phone held high as he live-streamed to his followers. At 6'2", with broad shoulders and arms covered in tattoos, Tyrell commanded attention wherever he went. His voice carried the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to performing. What up, T-Rex Nation? He called into his phone, his smile wide and predatory. Your boy's back on the streets of Chicago, about to bring you some real content. We're gonna see what these street people are really about. Dice's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept working, his movements becoming more deliberate. Milo lifted his head, ears perked forward, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Tyrell approached Dice's cart, his phone still recording. Yo, what's good, hot dog man? You making that real Chicago money out here? Just trying to make an honest living, Dice replied, his tone carefully neutral. Years of working the streets had taught him to read people and everything about Tyrell. Scream trouble. Honest living, huh? Tyrell laughed, the sound harsh against the afternoon's natural rhythm. That's cute. You know what's not honest? Selling mystery meat to tourists and calling it gourmet. He turned to address his phone directly. Y'all see this? This is what I'm talking about. People hustling dreams instead of facing reality. Zoe's camera instinctively swung toward the interaction. Something about Tyrell's tone made her skin crawl, the way he spoke about Dice like he was an exhibit rather than a human being. Man, I got permits, health inspections, everything legit, Dice said, his voice gaining an edge. I'm not hurting. Nobody. Not hurting nobody. Tyrell stepped closer, his bulk casting a shadow across the cart. You're hurting my followers' stomachs just looking at this setup. Where's the refrigeration? Where's the everything's up to code? Dice interrupted, his hand moving protectively toward Milo's leash. The dog had risen to his feet, his body language alert but not aggressive. Marco's pencil had stopped moving. Mrs. Patel's flower arranging had slowed to a crawl. Even the pigeons seemed to sense the tension building in the air. Tyrell's eyes swept the scene, and that's when he noticed Zoe's camera pointed in his direction. For a moment, his performer's smile faltered, replaced by something calculating and cold. Well, he said, his voice dropping to a register. That made Mrs. Patel take a step back behind her stall. Looks like we got ourselves a documentary crew. You getting all this film school? Zoe's finger tightened on her camera, but she didn't lower it. Just capturing the real Chicago, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Tyrell's smile returned, but it had transformed into something sharp and hungry. Real Chicago, huh? You want real? He looked directly into her lens, his eyes boring into her through the viewfinder. Stick around, sweetheart. I'm about to show you what real looks like. The warning in his voice was unmistakable. Dice shifted his weight, ready to step forward. Marco's hand moved toward his phone. Mrs. Patel clutched her flowers tighter. Even Milo seemed to sense that something was about to break. In the distance, a figure emerged from a small espresso booth, moving with unhurried precision through the crowd. But no one noticed him yet. All eyes were fixed on Tyrell as he began to circle Zoe's position like a predator sizing up its prey. The ordinary afternoon was about to become anything but ordinary. The atmosphere on the sidewalk grew thick with tension as Tyrell's attention shifted away from Dice and zeroed in on a young woman selling handmade jewelry from a small folding table. Rosa Gutierrez had been working the same corner for 3 years, her intricate beadwork and silver earrings drawing customers who appreciated authentic craftsmanship. She spoke limited English, but her warm smile and genuine enthusiasm for her work transcended language barriers. Oh, look what we got. Here, Tyrell announced to his phone, his voice taking on the exaggerated tone of a carnival barker. Traditional ethnic crafts. T-Rex Nation, this is what I'm talking about. People bringing their whole countries with them instead of adapting to American culture. He approached Rosa's table, his phone camera capturing her confused expression as she looked up at the large man looming over her display. Hola, señorita, he said, his pronunciation deliberately butchered. You got permits for this little setup? Rosa's English was halting but determined. Yes, sir. I have all papers. Legal business. Legal business, Tyrell repeated mockingly, turning to address his livestream audience. Y'all hearing? This accent. This is what happens when people don't respect the culture they're trying to join. You come to America, you learn American, am I right? Zoe's camera had been recording the entire exchange, her journalistic instincts overriding her personal discomfort. This was exactly the kind of casual cruelty she wanted to document, the way power could be wielded to humiliate and dehumanize. Excuse me, Rosa said, her voice growing smaller as Tyrell's presence became more aggressive. I am learning English. I take classes at night school. Night school, Tyrell laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's cute. Real cute. But meanwhile, you're out here taking jobs from real Americans, right? selling trinkets to tourists who don't know better. He reached out and picked up one of Rosa's necklaces, examining it with exaggerated scrutiny. What's this supposed to be? Some kind of voodoo charm? It's traditional Mexican design, Rosa explained, her hands trembling slightly as she reached. For the necklace. My grandmother teach me. Very old pattern. Your grandmother, huh? Tyrell's voice grew crueler. Let me guess. She crossed the border in the trunk of a car too? The words hit Rosa like a physical blow. Her face flushed with shame and anger, but she was trapped. Economically dependent on this corner, legally vulnerable, and facing someone who clearly thrived on her discomfort. That's when Zoe stepped forward, her camera still rolling. Hey, she called out, her voice cutting through Tyrell's monologue. That's enough. Tyrell's head snapped around, his eyes narrowing as he focused on her. Excuse me? Did I ask for your opinion, college girl? I'm asking you to leave her alone, Zoe said, her camera steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. She's just trying to make a living. Just trying to make a living, Tyrell repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He abandoned Rosa's table and began walking toward Zoe, his phone still recording. And what about you? What are you trying to make? A documentary about how unfair America is to poor immigrants? The crowd around them had grown larger, drawn by the commotion. Office workers on their lunch breaks, tourists with cameras, local residents who knew the daily rhythms of the street. All of them had stopped to watch. Phones emerged from pockets and purses, creating a forest of recording devices, all pointed at the unfolding confrontation. I'm documenting real life, Zoe said, her voice growing stronger, including what happens when people abuse their privilege to intimidate others. Privilege? Tyrell's laugh was harsh and bitter. You want to talk about privilege? You think I got privilege? You think growing up in Cabrini Green was privilege? You think bouncing between foster homes was privilege? His personal revelation caught Zoe off guard, but she didn't lower her camera. I'm not talking about your background. I'm talking about your choices. Right now, this moment, my choices. Tyrell's voice rose, and several people in the crowd took instinctive steps backward. My choice is to show my million followers what's really happening in America. My choice is to ask the questions nobody else will ask. He gestured broadly at Rosa, who had begun quietly packing up her jewelry, her hands shaking. That woman is part of a system that's destroying American jobs, American culture, American values. And you, he pointed directly at Zoe. You're part of the system that covers it up. That makes excuses. That calls people like me racist for asking hard questions. There's a difference between asking questions and being cruel, Zoe said, her camera capturing every word. You're not a journalist. You're a bully with a platform. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Tyrell's face darkened, and for a moment, the mask of the performer slipped completely. What remained was raw, wounded ego wrapped in barely contained rage. Bully, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. You think I'm a bully? He reached out and knocked over Rosa's small folding table, sending jewelry scattering across the sidewalk. Beads rolled into the gutter, earrings tangled together, hours of careful work destroyed in seconds. Stop, Rosa cried out, dropping to her knees to gather her scattered work. Please, sir, this is how I feed my children. But Tyrell wasn't finished. He turned back to Zoe, his eyes blazing with fury. You want to document real life? You want to see what happens when someone disrespects T-Rex in front of his million followers? I'm not disrespecting you, Zoe said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. I'm holding you accountable. Accountable? Tyrell stepped closer, invading her personal space. Who made you the accountability police? Who gave you the right to judge me? The crowd around them had grown restless. Some people were calling for someone to intervene, but no one stepped forward. The classic bystander effect was in full display. Everyone watching, everyone recording, no one acting. Dice had moved from behind his cart, Milo trotting beside him on his leash. The dog's ears were flat against his head, and he whined softly, sensing the escalating tension. Maybe we should all just calm down, Dice called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd broken up street fights before. No need for this to get ugly. Stay out of this, hot dog man. Tyrell snarled without taking his eyes off Zoe. This is between me and documentary girl here. My name is Zoe. she said, her camera never wavering. "And I'm not afraid of you." It was exactly the wrong thing to say. Tyrell's hand shot out like a viper, his fingers tangling in Zoe's dark hair. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The crowd's collective gasp, Rose's scattered jewelry glinting in the sunlight, Milo's urgent barking, the steady hum of traffic and city life continuing obliviously around them. Then Tyrell jerked his hand backward, and Zoe's feet left the ground. The scream that tore from Zoe's throat cut through the ambient noise of the city like a blade. Tyrell's fist, wrapped tight in her hair, had found purchase at the roots, and with one violent motion, he yanked her off balance. Her camera flew from her hands, clattering across the concrete. But somehow the recording continued, the lens now capturing a sideways view of scuffling feet and horrified faces. "You want to document real life?" Tyrell roared, his voice carrying over the chaos. "Document this." He dragged her 3 steps down the sidewalk, her knees hitting the pavement hard. The sound of fabric tearing mixed with her cries of pain as she clawed at his arm, trying to relieve the pressure on her scalp. But Tyrell was strong, and he was angry, and the adrenaline of performance had transformed him into something monstrous. "Oh my God! Oh my God!" someone in the crowd shouted. But the voice seemed to come from very far away. Dice had dropped Milo's leash and was fumbling with his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely activate the camera. "Call 911, he yelled to no one in particular. "Somebody call the police." But the crowd had fallen into that strange paralysis that overtakes groups witnessing violence. They circled the scene like vultures, phones raised, everyone recording, no one intervening. The modern Colosseum had arrived, and they were all complicit spectators. "This is what happens," Tyrell announced to his live stream, his voice breathless with exertion and excitement. "When people disrespect T-Rex, when they try to make me look bad in front of my followers. This is the consequence of trying to cancel me." He jerked Zoe's hair again, forcing her to look up at him. Her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes blazed with defiance. "You're making yourself look bad," she managed to gasp out. "Smile for the camera, documentary girl," he taunted, holding his phone close to her face. "Show my million followers what a real victim looks like." Marco had stepped away from his easel, his art supplies forgotten as he recorded the scene from a different angle. His artist's eye captured details that others missed, the way Zoe's fingers dug into the concrete, searching for purchase, the absolute stillness of Mrs. Patel as she watched from behind her flower stall, the way Milo strained against his loose leash, every muscle in his body tense with the desire to intervene. "This is insane," Marco whispered to his phone. "This is completely insane. Someone needs to stop this." But no one moved. A woman in a business suit had her phone out, recording but staying well back from the action. A group of teenagers watched with the kind of fascination usually reserved for car crashes. Even a pair of uniformed security guards from a nearby building had emerged to watch, but they made no move to intervene. Rosa had given up trying to collect her scattered jewelry and was now pressed against the brick wall of the building behind her stall, one hand covering her mouth, the other clutching her chest. Her eyes were wide with terror, recognizing in Tyrell's violence an echo of every threat she'd ever faced as a vulnerable immigrant in an hostile environment. "Please," she whispered, though no one could hear her over the chaos. "Please, someone help her." Tyrell dragged Zoe another few feet, her body leaving a trail of scraped fabric and skin on the concrete. "You think you're better than me?" he snarled down at her. "You think your little college education makes you special? Your little documentary project?" "I think," Zoe said, her voice strained but somehow steady, "that you're a coward who picks on people smaller than you." The words hit their mark. Tyrell's face contorted with rage, and he raised his free hand as if to strike her. The crowd's collective gasp was audible even over the street noise. That's when the pocket of stillness appeared. At first, it was just a shift in the crowd's attention. Heads turned slightly, creating a small parting in the ring of spectators. Then the murmur began, not the excited chatter of people watching a spectacle, but something different. Something that carried recognition and surprise. A figure emerged from the small coffee stand that had been serving the lunch crowd. He moved with unhurried precision, his steps measured and deliberate. Nothing about him suggested urgency or panic. He simply walked forward as if he had all the time in the world, his presence somehow commanding space around him. Dice was the first to recognize him. "Holy shit," he breathed, his phone camera swinging toward the newcomer. "Is that?" The man was maybe 60, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. He wore simple clothes, dark jeans, a button-down shirt, comfortable walking shoes. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed celebrity or authority. But there was something in his bearing, in the way he moved, that made people step aside without being asked. "That's Steven Seagal," someone in the crowd whispered, and the name rippled through the gathering like electricity. "No way," another voice responded. "That's really him." But Steven Seagal wasn't paying attention to the crowd's recognition. His dark eyes were fixed on Tyrell with laser focus, taking in every detail of the scene. His expression was calm, almost serene, but there was something in his gaze that made several people in the crowd unconsciously step backward. He stopped about 10 feet from where Tyrell held Zoe, his hands at his sides, his posture relaxed but somehow coiled. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried with perfect clarity over the chaos. "Let her go." The words weren't shouted or demanding. They were simply stated, as if he was commenting on the weather. But something in his tone caused an immediate hush to fall over the crowd. Tyrell's head snapped up, his grip on Zoe's hair loosening slightly as he focused on this new presence. "What did you say?" "I said let her go," Steven repeated, his voice maintaining the same calm cadence. "This stops now." For a moment, the tableau held. Tyrell with his fist wrapped in Zoe's hair, Zoe on her knees on the concrete, Steven standing with perfect stillness 10 feet away. The crowd around them had gone completely silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Milo had stopped barking. Even the street noise seemed to fade into the background, as if the entire city was holding its breath. Then Tyrell's performer's instincts kicked in, and he began to smile. It was the same predatory grin he'd worn when approaching Rose's table, but now it was tinged with something else, a kind of manic excitement at the prospect of a bigger stage. Well, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "Steven Seagal. The Steven Seagal. This is perfect. This is absolutely perfect." He addressed his phone camera directly, his grip on Zoe's hair tightening again. "T-Rex Nation, you are about to witness history. Your boy is about to go toe-to-toe with a Hollywood legend. This is the content y'all been waiting for." Steven said nothing. He simply stood there, his dark eyes never leaving Tyrell's face, his breathing slow and controlled. There was no threat in his posture, no aggression in his stance. But something about his presence had changed the entire dynamic of the scene. The crowd sensed it too. Phones were still recording, but the energy had shifted from voyeuristic excitement to something more primal. They were no longer watching a spectacle. They were witnessing a confrontation between two completely different types of power. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And in that moment of perfect tension, as the city held its breath around them, Steven Seagal took his first step forward. The coffee cup in Steven Seagal's left hand was half full of espresso, steam still rising from the dark liquid. He set it down on the edge of a nearby planter with the same careful precision he might use when placing a chess piece, deliberate, unhurried, significant. The simple gesture somehow commanded more attention than all of Tyrell's shouting and posturing. His sunglasses came off next, folded once, and tucked into his shirt pocket. The movement revealed eyes that had seen too much, learned too much, and found a kind of peace in the knowing. They were the eyes of someone who had moved beyond the need to prove anything to anyone. The crowd parted around him like water around a stone. There was no pushing, no shoving, no verbal commands. People simply felt the need to step aside, to give him the space he seemed to naturally occupy. Even those who didn't recognize him instinctively understood that something had fundamentally changed in the dynamic of the situation. Dice had lowered his phone slightly, his mouth hanging open in amazement. "That's really him," he whispered to Marco, who was still sketching frantically, trying to capture the moment. "That's really Steven freaking Seagal." "I know," Marco replied, his pencil never stopping. "I've been watching his movies since I was a kid. But this is different. This is real." Mrs. Patel had emerged from behind her flower stall, clutching a small bouquet of white roses to her chest. There was something in her posture that suggested she was witnessing something sacred, something that would be talked about for years to come. Tyrell had released Zoe's hair completely now, his attention fully captured by this new presence. She remained on her knees, but her hand had found her fallen camera, and she was recording again, her instincts as a documentarian overriding her physical pain. "This is unbelievable," she whispered into her camera, her voice thick with emotion. "This is absolutely unbelievable." Stephen took another step forward, and then another. His movement was liquid, controlled, each step placed with the kind of precision that spoke of decades of martial arts training. But there was nothing aggressive about his approach. If anything, he seemed to be walking through a meditation garden, completely at peace with himself and his surroundings. "So you're the famous Steven Seagal," Tyrell said, his voice carrying a forced bravado that didn't quite mask his uncertainty. "The Aikido master. The action hero. The guy who thinks he's a real cop." Steven's expression didn't change. He continued his slow, measured approach, his breathing deep and controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet authority it had before. "I'm someone who doesn't walk past this," he said simply. "Walk past what?" Tyrell challenged, puffing out his chest in an attempt to reassert his dominance over the situation. "Walk past me teaching a lesson to someone who disrespected me in front of my followers." "Walk past a woman being hurt," Stephen replied, his tone remaining conversational. "Walk past someone using their size and strength to intimidate instead of protect." The words hit the crowd like a physical force. Several people nodded unconsciously, recognizing the truth in what he was saying. This wasn't about celebrity or martial arts or internet fame. This was about the fundamental choice between standing up for what was right and allowing cruelty to continue unchallenged. Tyrell's live stream was exploding with comments, but he was too focused on Stephen to read them. His million followers were watching their hero come face to face with a legend, and the energy was intoxicating. This was the kind of content that would be talked about for years. "You know what?" Tyrell said, his voice growing more animated. "This is perfect. This is exactly what I needed." Steven Seagal, the has-been action star, trying to play hero in real life. "My followers are going to love this." He gestured broadly at the gathering crowd, his phone still recording. "Look at all these people. Look at all these cameras. This is going to be the most viral video of the year, maybe the decade." Stephen had stopped his approach about 6 feet away from Tyrell, well within striking distance for someone with his training, but his hands remained at his sides. There was no tension in his shoulders, no coiling of muscles preparing for action. He simply stood there, a picture of calm in the eye of the storm. "This isn't about cameras," he said, his voice carrying easily over the ambient noise. "This isn't about followers or going viral. This is about choosing who you want to be in this moment." "Who I want to be?" Tyrell laughed, but there was a brittle quality to the sound. "I know exactly who I am. I'm T-Rex. I'm the guy who asks the hard questions. I'm the voice of the people who don't have a voice." "You're someone who just dragged a woman across the pavement by her hair," Stephen said, his tone remaining perfectly level. "You're someone who destroyed another woman's work because you could. You're someone who mistakes cruelty for strength." The words were delivered without anger, without judgment, but they cut through Tyrell's defenses like a blade. For a moment, his mask slipped, and something vulnerable showed through. The foster kid who'd never learned that he was worth loving. The young man who'd found identity in online validation because he'd never found it anywhere else. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by renewed aggression. "You don't know anything about me," Tyrell snarled, taking a step toward Stephen. "You don't know where I came from or what I've been through. You don't know what it's like to fight for everything you have." "I know what I see," Stephen replied, his voice never wavering. "I see someone who's in pain. I see someone who's been hurt. And I see someone who's choosing to pass that hurt on to others instead of healing from it." The observation was delivered with such gentle clarity that it stopped Tyrell in his tracks. Around them, the crowd had grown completely silent, hanging on every word of this unexpected confrontation. Zoe had managed to get to her feet, her camera still rolling. There were scrapes on her knees and arms, and her hair was disheveled, but Her eyes were bright with the recognition that she was witnessing something extraordinary. "This is what real power looks like," she whispered into her camera. "This is what strength actually means." Milo had somehow slipped his leash and was now sitting at Stephen's feet, his tail wagging slowly. The dog's presence seemed to complete the picture, the calm center around which the chaos had organized itself. Stephen reached down and gave Milo a gentle scratch behind the ears, his attention never leaving Tyrell's face. "You have a choice," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You can keep going down this path, using your platform to hurt people, to spread anger and division. Or you can choose something different." "And what would that be?" Tyrell asked, his voice smaller now, less performative. "You can choose to be someone who protects instead of destroys," Stephen said. "Someone who lifts people up instead of tearing them down. Someone who uses their strength to make the world a little bit better instead of a little bit worse." The words hung in the air like a challenge, an invitation, and a promise all at once. For a moment, it seemed like Tyrell might actually consider them, might actually choose a different path. Then he looked at his phone, saw the thousands of viewers, remembered who he was supposed to be, and the mask slammed back into place. "Enough," he said, his voice returning to its earlier aggression. "Enough of this philosophical bullshit. You want to be a hero? You want to save the day? Then let's do this properly." He shoved his phone into the hands of a nearby spectator, telling them to keep recording. When he turned back to Stephen, his fists were clenched, his stance wide and aggressive. "Come on, old man," he taunted, his voice carrying clearly over the silent crowd. "Show me what you've got. Show me if all those movies meant anything. Show me if you're really as tough as you pretend to be." Steven Seagal stood perfectly still, his hands still at his sides, his breathing deep and controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet authority it had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. "I don't have to show you anything," he said, "but I won't let you hurt her again." And in that moment, as the crowd held its breath and the cameras rolled, everyone understood that they were about to witness something that would be talked about for years to come. Not just a fight, but a demonstration of what it really meant to be strong, what it really meant to be a protector, what it really meant to choose love over fear, even in the face of violence. The stage was set. The moment had arrived. And Steven Seagal was ready. The silence stretched between Stephen and Tyrell like a taut wire, crackling with potential energy. Everything else, the traffic, the distant conversations, even the pigeons, seemed to fade into background static. The world had narrowed to this moment, this choice, this confrontation between two fundamentally different philosophies of power. Tyrell's chest heaved with adrenaline and performance anxiety. His million followers were watching. This was his moment to prove that internet fame translated to real-world dominance, that T-Rex Monroe wasn't just a screen name, but a force to be reckoned with in the physical realm. "You know what your problem is, old man," Tyrell said, beginning to circle Stephen like a predator sizing up prey. "You think this is one of your movies. You think you can just walk in here with that mystical warrior bullshit and everyone's going to back down." Stephen remained motionless at the center of Tyrell's orbit, his feet planted, his breathing steady. His dark eyes tracked Tyrell's movement with the patience of someone who had learned to read violence before it happened, to see the telegraph in a shoulder's tension, the warning in a shift of weight. "This isn't a movie," Stephen said quietly. "This is a choice. Your choice. My choice." Tyrell's voice cracked slightly, the strain of maintaining his aggressive persona beginning to show. "You're damn right it's my choice. And I choose to show my followers what happens when some washed-up Hollywood fake tries to play hero in the real world." The crowd pressed closer, but not too close. Something about the energy between the two men warned them to maintain distance. Phones continued recording from every angle, capturing the moment for posterity, for viral fame, for evidence. Dice had abandoned his card entirely, Milo's leash wrapped around his wrist as he held his phone steady. "This is really happening," he whispered to his camera. "Steven Seagal is about to throw down with T-Rex Monroe on my block. I can't believe this is my life right now." Marco's sketching had become frantic, his artist's eye trying to capture not just the physical positioning, but the emotional electricity in the air. "You can feel it," he murmured. "The tension, like the air before a thunderstorm." Mrs. Patel had pressed herself against the brick wall, still clutching her white roses. Her English wasn't perfect, but she understood the universal language of conflict, the moment when words stopped working and bodies took over. Zoe had positioned herself behind a parked car, her camera steady despite the tremor in her hands. Her journalistic instincts warred with her human fear. This was the story of a lifetime, but it was also potentially about to become very dangerous. "You want to know what I think?" Tyrell continued, his voice growing louder, more theatrical. "I think you're scared. I think you know that all your movie magic and choreographed fights can't help you in a real situation with a real opponent." Steven's expression didn't change. If anything, he seemed to grow more relaxed, more centered. "I think you're hurting," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite its softness. "I think you've been hurting for a long time, and you don't know how to stop." The words hit Tyrell like a physical blow. For a moment, his circling stopped, his aggressive posture faltering. Something raw and vulnerable flickered across his face. The abandoned child, the teenager bouncing between foster homes, the young man who had learned that attention, even negative attention, was better than being invisible. But the moment passed, quickly, replaced by rage at being seen so clearly. "You don't know shit about me." Tyrell roared and lunged forward. His first punch was a wide, powerful haymaker aimed at Steven's jaw. It carried all his frustration, all his pain, all his desperate need to prove himself. It was the kind of punch that could have knocked out most people, the kind of blow that had settled playground disputes and barroom brawls. Steven moved like water, not backward, not away, but around. His left hand rose gently, almost casually, intercepting Tyrell's wrist and guiding the punch past his head with minimal effort. Tyrell's momentum carried him forward, off balance, stumbling past his intended target. The crowd gasped collectively. Several people shouted in amazement. This wasn't the kind of dramatic, explosive fight they'd expected from movies. This was something entirely different, elegant, controlled, almost dance-like in its precision. "What the hell?" Tyrell spun around, confusion and anger warring in his voice. "Fight me for real." "I am," Steven replied calmly. "But I'm not trying to hurt you." Tyrell charged again, this time leading with his shoulder, trying to tackle Steven to the ground. But Steven simply wasn't there when the impact should have happened. He had moved just enough, turned just slightly, so that Tyrell's charge carried him past and into empty air. This time, Steven's hand found Tyrell's shoulder as he passed, not striking but guiding, redirecting his energy in a way that sent him stumbling toward the curb. Tyrell caught himself before falling, but barely. "Stop playing with me." Tyrell's voice cracked with frustration. "Stop running away and fight." "I'm not running," Steven said, his position unchanged from where he'd started. "I'm simply not giving you what you want. What I want is to kick your ass." "No," Steven said with quiet certainty. "What you want is for me to be angry. You want me to hate you back. You want me to validate the story you tell yourself about the world, that it's violent, that might makes right, that the only way to be strong is to break things." The psychological accuracy of the observation staggered Tyrell. He stood there, fists clenched, chest heaving, suddenly uncertain about everything he thought he knew about this confrontation. "But I won't give you that," Steven continued, "because it isn't true, and because you deserve better than the story you've been telling yourself." Tyrell's face contorted with a mixture of rage and something that might have been grief. "Shut up," he screamed, and threw another punch, this one faster, more desperate. Steven caught his wrist mid-swing, not violently but firmly, the way someone might catch a falling glass. For a moment, the two men stood frozen in that position, Tyrell's fist inches from Steven's face, Steven's hand wrapped gently around Tyrell's wrist. "You're strong," Steven said quietly, speaking only to Tyrell. Now, ignoring the crowd completely. "You're much stronger than you know. But strength isn't about what you can break. It's about what you can protect, what you can build, what you can heal." Tyrell's arm began to tremble, not from Steven's grip, but from the emotional weight of being truly seen, truly understood. For a terrifying moment, he felt the walls he'd built around himself beginning to crack. Then he remembered the cameras, remembered his audience, remembered who he was supposed to be. "Get off me," he snarled, and tried to break free. Steven released him immediately, stepping back with his hands raised peacefully. "You're free to go," he said. "You always were. The choice is yours." But Tyrell was too far gone now, too committed to the performance, too afraid of what his followers would think if he backed down. He reached into his waistband and pulled out a folding knife, the blade clicking open with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. The crowd's gasp was audible from blocks away. Several people screamed. Some ran. Others pressed closer, unable to look away from the sudden escalation. Zoe's camera shook as she zoomed in on the blade, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it over the street noise. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He's got a knife." Stephen looked at the weapon with the same calm assessment he'd shown everything else. No fear, no anger, just acknowledgement of a changed situation. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had seen this moment play out countless times before. "Don't tell me what I want." Tyrell brandished the knife wildly, his movements becoming more erratic, more desperate. "I'm tired of people telling me what I want, what I should do, who I should be." "Then choose who you want to be," Stephen said simply. "Right now? In this moment. Choose." The knife trembled in Tyrell's hand. Around them, the world held its breath. The afternoon sun caught the blade of Tyrell's knife, sending sharp reflections dancing across the watching faces. In that crystalline moment, the nature of the confrontation shifted completely. What had been a psychological chess match became a life-or-death situation, and everyone present understood the gravity of the change. Tyrell held the weapon like a talisman against his own fear, his grip tight but unsteady. The knife was a cheap folding model, probably purchased at a gas station, but its edge was sharp enough to kill. More importantly, it represented the final escalation, the point beyond which there could be no pretense of performance or play. "This is what real power looks like," Tyrell shouted to his phone camera, which was still being held by a trembling spectator. "This is how you handle disrespect in the real world." Stephen remained perfectly still, his hands at his sides, his breathing deep and controlled. If the knife concerned him, nothing in his posture suggested it. He seemed to be studying Tyrell, with the same calm attention he might give to a complicated chess problem. "Power," Stephen said quietly. "You think that knife makes you powerful?" "I think this knife makes you take me seriously," Tyrell replied, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool breeze. "I think this knife proves I'm not playing games." "The only thing that knife proves," Stephen said, his voice carrying clearly over the hushed crowd, "is that you're afraid." The words stung because they were true. Tyrell could feel his carefully constructed persona crumbling, could sense his million followers watching him become exactly what he'd always secretly feared he was: weak, desperate, pathetic. "I'm not afraid of anything," he screamed, and lunged forward with the blade. What happened next would be analyzed frame by frame on countless videos, debated in martial arts forums, and studied in self-defense courses for years to come. It was a masterclass in Aikido principles, a demonstration of how true mastery looked when applied with perfect precision and absolute restraint. Stephen moved like liquid mercury, flowing around Tyrell's attack rather than meeting it head-on. His right hand rose to intercept Tyrell's wrist, not grabbing but guiding, redirecting the knife's trajectory away from his body. At the same time, his left hand found Tyrell's elbow, and with a subtle shift of pressure and angle, he sent Tyrell's own momentum working against him. Tyrell found himself spinning, off balance, his knife hand twisted harmlessly behind his back. The weapon clattered to the concrete, forgotten in the confusion of suddenly finding himself face down on the sidewalk with Stephen's knee gently but firmly placed between his shoulder blades. "What the? How did?" Tyrell gasped, struggling against the hold but finding no leverage, no way to escape without causing himself more pain. "Shoo," Stephen said softly, his voice carrying none of the triumph or aggression that might be expected from someone who had just disarmed a dangerous attacker. "It's over. You're safe now." "Safe?" Tyrell's voice was muffled against the concrete. "You're the one holding me down. I'm holding you down so you don't hurt yourself or anyone else," Stephen explained patiently. "But you're safe. No one's going to hurt you. No one's going to humiliate you. This is just a moment, and like all moments, it will pass." The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, phones capturing every angle of the takedown and its surprisingly gentle aftermath. But Stephen ignored the acclaim completely, his attention focused entirely on the young man beneath him. "Let me up," Tyrell demanded, but there was less fire in his voice now, more confusion than rage. In a moment, Stephen said, "First, I want you to breathe. Can you do that for me? Just breathe." "I don't want to breathe. I want you to let me up so I can." "So you can what?" Stephen's voice remained perfectly calm. "Continue this performance? Keep trying to prove something to people who don't really know you?" Tyrell's struggle slowed, then stopped altogether. The weight of Stephen's words, combined with the physical impossibility of escape, seemed to drain the fight out of him. "You don't understand," Tyrell said, his voice smaller now, almost childlike. "I can't just walk away. My followers, they expect you to be human," Stephen said gently. "They expect you to make mistakes, to learn, to grow. The ones who don't expect that, those aren't followers. Those are just people looking for entertainment at your expense." Zoe had moved closer, her camera capturing the intimate moment of this unexpected counseling session taking place on a Chicago sidewalk. There was something profound happening here, something that transcended the viral spectacle everyone had expected. "I've never backed down from a fight," Tyrell whispered, as if admitting a terrible secret. "This isn't backing down," Stephen replied. "This is choosing a different kind of strength. The kind that builds instead of breaks. The kind that protects instead of destroys." Around them, the crowd had grown quieter, more thoughtful. The initial excitement of witnessing a fight had given way to something deeper, recognition that they were watching a moment of genuine human transformation. Dice had tears in his eyes as he recorded the scene. "Y'all," he said to his phone, his voice thick with emotion, "this is what real strength looks like. This is what being a man actually means." Marco's sketching had slowed to capture the tender moment. The way Stephen's hand rested protectively on Tyrell's shoulder, the way Tyrell's face had relaxed from aggressive mask to vulnerable humanity. Mrs. Patel had approached slowly, still clutching her white roses. When she reached the edge of the scene, she knelt down and placed one of the flowers where Tyrell could see it, a small gesture of forgiveness and hope. "I want to get up now," Tyrell said quietly. "Okay," Stephen replied, "but slowly and peacefully. Can you do that?" Tyrell nodded against the concrete, and Stephen gradually released the hold, helping him to his feet with surprising gentleness. For a moment, the two men stood facing each other, the crowd watching in absolute silence. Tyrell's eyes were red with unshed tears, his carefully maintained exterior completely stripped away. He looked younger somehow, more vulnerable like the frightened child he'd once been. "I don't know how to be different," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "You start with one choice," Stephen said, his hand resting lightly on Tyrell's shoulder. Then another. That's all any of us can do." The sound of approaching sirens began to penetrate the afternoon air, growing louder with each passing second. Someone had called the police, and reality was about to intrude on this moment of unexpected grace. "What happens now?" Tyrell asked, panic beginning to creep back into his voice. "Now you face the consequences of your choices," Stephen said matter-of-factly. "But you don't face them alone. And you don't face them as the same person who started this confrontation." The first police car rounded the corner, its lights flashing but its sirens silent. The crowd began to shift and murmur, the spell of the moment beginning to break as official authority arrived on the scene. But something had changed in those few minutes. Something important had happened between Steven Seagal and Tyrell Monroe. Something that all the cameras and all the social media attention couldn't diminish or distort. A lesson in what strength really meant. A demonstration of how power could be used to heal rather than harm. A masterclass in the difference between breaking someone and helping them become whole. The sirens grew louder, but the echo of that lesson would last much longer. The blade of Tyrell's knife caught the light one final time before it clattered harmlessly across the concrete, spinning to a stop near the gutter where it lay like a discarded piece of someone's broken dreams. The metallic sound of steel on pavement seemed to echo far longer than physics should have allowed, a punctuation mark in the story that was being written on this ordinary Chicago street. Officer Lena O'Connor was the first to arrive, her patrol car sliding to a stop with practiced precision. She emerged from the vehicle with her hand resting casually on her service weapon, her trained eyes immediately assessing the scene. The large crowd, the scattered phones recording everything, the two men standing close together in what looked like intimate conversation rather than confrontation. "Chicago PD," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of 15 years on the force. "I need everyone to step back and give me some space to work." The crowd complied reluctantly, phones still recording, but from a more respectful distance. O'Connor had dealt with viral incidents before, knew how quickly a situation could spiral out of control when everyone felt like they were directing their own movie. Her eyes found the knife first, lying abandoned near the curb. Then they moved to Tyrell, whose face still showed the tear tracks of his breakdown, and finally to Stephen, who stood with the same calm presence he'd maintained throughout the entire confrontation. "Sir," she said, addressing Stephen first, "are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine," Stephen replied quietly. No one was hurt. O'Connor's gaze shifted to Tyrell, who was staring at the ground as if trying to memorize the pattern of cracks in the sidewalk. "And you, sir? Are you injured?" Tyrell shook his head wordlessly, unable to meet her eyes. "Okay," O'Connor said, her voice taking on the patient tone she used for domestic disturbances and mental health calls. "I'm going to need to understand what happened here. But first, I need to secure that weapon." She moved toward the knife, her body language careful and non-threatening. As she knelt to pick it up, she noticed the tremor in Tyrell's hands, the way he kept glancing at Stephen as if seeking reassurance. "Can someone tell me who this knife belongs to?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from Tyrell's body language. "It's mine," Tyrell said quietly, his voice barely audible over the street noise. "Thank you for being honest," O'Connor said, slipping the knife into an evidence bag. "That's a good start. Now, can you tell me what happened here?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Tyrell's live stream was still going, his followers still watching, waiting to see how their hero would handle this moment of reckoning. He could lie, could spin the story to make himself the victim, could play the card that had gotten him out of trouble so many times before. Instead, he looked at Stephen, then at Zoe, who was still recording from behind her car. He saw Mrs. Patel, with her flowers, Dice with his concerned expression, Marco with his sketch pad. He saw a community that had witnessed his breakdown, his transformation, his moment of choice. "I attacked her," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "The girl, with the camera. I grabbed her hair and dragged her. I was angry and I wanted to hurt her, and I did." O'Connor's eyebrows rose slightly. In 15 years of police work, she'd rarely heard such immediate, complete confession to assault charges. "And the knife?" she prompted gently. "I pulled it on him," Tyrell said, nodding toward Stephen. "When he tried to stop me, I don't know what I was going to do. Something bad." O'Connor looked between the two men, trying to understand the dynamic she was seeing. Victims of knife attacks didn't usually stand this close to their attackers. Attackers didn't usually confess this readily to attempted assault with a deadly weapon. "Mr." she began, addressing Stephen. "Seagal," he said simply. "Stephen Seagal." O'Connor's composure slipped for just a moment. "The Stephen Seagal?" "Just Stephen is fine." She recovered quickly, falling back on her training. "Mr. Seagal, do you wish to press charges against this individual for assault with a deadly weapon?" The question that could determine the trajectory of Tyrell's entire life. A felony conviction would mean prison time, would mean the end of his social media career, would mean starting over from nothing with the additional burden of a criminal record. Stephen looked at Tyrell for a long moment, seeing not the aggressive performer but the broken young man underneath. "No," he said finally. "I don't." "Sir," O'Connor said carefully, "I want to make sure you understand what you're saying. This individual threatened you with a knife in front of dozens of witnesses. We have video evidence of the attack. This is a serious felony." "I understand," Stephen replied, "and I'm choosing not to press charges." Tyrell's legs nearly gave out from relief. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet," Stephen said gently. "Thank me by making different choices going forward." O'Connor turned to Zoe, who had approached with her camera still rolling. "Ma'am, you were also a victim of assault. Do you wish to press charges?" Zoe looked at her scraped knees, felt the tender spots on her scalp where Tyrell's fingers had twisted in her hair. She thought about the fear she'd felt, the helplessness, the violation of being dragged across concrete like an object. Then, she looked at Tyrell, saw the genuine remorse in his eyes, the way he seemed diminished and lost without his aggressive mask. "I," she started, then stopped. The decision felt enormous, weighted with implications she couldn't fully grasp. "Take your time," O'Connor said kindly. "This is your choice to make." "Can I ask him something first?" Zoe said. O'Connor nodded, and Zoe approached Tyrell slowly, her camera still recording. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why did you hurt me? Why did you destroy Rose's things? Why do you think that's okay?" Tyrell's face crumpled. "Because I hurt," he said, the words torn from somewhere deep inside. "Because I've been hurting for so long I forgot there was any other way to feel. Because when I see people like you, smart, confident, making something of your lives, it reminds me of everything I'm not." The honesty in his voice was devastating. Several people in the crowd wiped away tears. "And now?" Zoe pressed. "What changes now?" "I don't know," Tyrell admitted. "I don't know how to be different. But I want to try. I want to figure out how to stop hurting people just because I hurt." Zoe lowered her camera for the first time since the confrontation began. "No charges," she said to O'Connor. "But I want him to get help. Real help." O'Connor nodded. "I can arrange for information about anger management programs, counseling services, community service opportunities." "I'll pay for counseling," Stephen said quietly. "And I'll personally ensure he follows through." The offer surprised everyone, including Tyrell. "Why would you do that?" "Because," Stephen said, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience, hurt people, but healed people help heal people. The choice of which one you become is always yours to make." O'Connor was taking notes, documenting one of the strangest assault calls of her career. No charges filed, victim and assailant embracing the possibility of redemption, a Hollywood actor offering to personally fund rehabilitation. "There will still be consequences," she said to Tyrell. "You'll need to come to the station to give a full statement. There will be paperwork, court appearances, community service requirements. The legal system doesn't just disappear because charges aren't pressed." "I understand," Tyrell said. "I'll do whatever you need me to do." As O'Connor finished her preliminary report, the crowd began to slowly disperse. But phones were still recording, still broadcasting this moment of unexpected grace to millions of viewers around the world. The story that would go viral wouldn't just be about a street fight or a celebrity intervention. It would be about the moment when violence transformed into healing, when power was used to lift up rather than tear down, when a community witnessed the possibility of redemption played out on an ordinary sidewalk. The knife was gone, secured, in an evidence bag. But the choice it had represented, the choice between destruction and creation, between harm and healing, that choice would echo far beyond this single afternoon. By the time the second and third police cars arrived, the crowd had swelled to nearly 100 people. Word was spreading through social media faster than wildfire. Seagal had just taken down an internet provocateur with a knife, and it was all caught on camera. The hashtags were already trending. Hashtag Steven Seagal Hero, hashtag Chicago Showdown, hashtag Aikido Master, hashtag T-Rex Takedown. Officer Maria Santos emerged from the second patrol car, immediately recognizing the signs of a viral moment in progress. The way people held their phones, the excited chatter, the reluctance to disperse despite police presence. She'd seen it all before during protests, celebrity sightings, and public incidents that captured the internet's attention. "Lena," she called to O'Connor. "What's the situation?" "Assault with a deadly weapon, but victims declining to press charges," O'Connor replied, her voice carrying the bewilderment of someone still processing the unusual turn of events. "Perpetrator confessed immediately, weapon secured, no injuries reported." Detective Ray Kowalski arrived in an unmarked car, drawn by the radio chatter about a potential celebrity incident. At 52, he'd worked enough high-profile cases to know that when Hollywood names got involved, simple street altercations could become media circuses requiring careful handling. He approached the central figures, Stephen standing calmly beside a clearly shaken young man, while a woman with a camera documented everything. The detective's trained eye immediately cataloged the details: scrapes on the woman's knees, torn clothing, the young man's red-rimmed eyes, and Stephen's impossibly serene demeanor. "Mr. Seagal," Detective Kowalski said, extending his hand. "I'm Detective Kowalski. I understand you were involved in an incident here." Stephen shook the offered hand firmly. I intervened when I saw someone being hurt. Nothing more complicated than that. And you are? Kowalski turned to Tyrell, who seemed to shrink under official scrutiny. Tyrell Monroe. I messed up. Bad. The detective's eyebrows rose at the immediate admission. Mr. Monroe, you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. I waive my rights, Tyrell said quickly. I want to tell you everything. I want to make this right. Kowalski exchanged glances with O'Connor. In their combined 30 years of police work, they'd rarely encountered such immediate cooperation from someone who'd just committed multiple felonies in front of dozens of witnesses. Sir, Kowalski said carefully, I strongly advise you to speak with an attorney before making any statements. I don't want an attorney, Tyrell said, his voice gaining strength. I want to take responsibility for what I did. Meanwhile, news vans were beginning to arrive. Channel 7, Fox News Chicago, WGN. The local media had monitoring police scanners and social media feeds, and Steven Seagal's name appearing in both had triggered immediate deployment of their street teams. Rebecca Martinez from Channel 7 was the first reporter on scene, her cameraman already rolling as she approached the police perimeter. This is Rebecca Martinez reporting live from River North, where action star Steven Seagal has allegedly intervened in a violent street assault. The presence of cameras seemed to energize the remaining crowd. People began positioning themselves for better shots, hoping to become part of the story themselves. Mrs. Patel had retreated to her flower stall, but continued watching with the fascination of someone witnessing history unfold. Dice had moved his hot dog cart closer to the action, partly from curiosity and partly from the business instinct that told him this crowd would be hungry. Milo sat beside the cart, his tail wagging as people stopped to pet him and ask if he'd witnessed the fight. Yeah, my dog saw the whole thing, Dice told a reporter from WGN. Milo here, he knew something was wrong before anybody else. Dogs can sense the kind of negative energy, you know? Marco had positioned himself where he could sketch both the police activity and the media response, his artist's eye capturing the circus atmosphere that had developed around what had been a moment of genuine human transformation. Detective Kowalski was attempting to conduct interviews while managing the growing media presence. I need to speak with witnesses, he announced to O'Connor. Starting with the victim, Zoe approached with her camera, which she'd continued recording throughout the police response. I'm Zoe Martinez. I was making a documentary about street vendors when this happened. And you captured the entire incident on camera? Multiple angles, Zoe confirmed. From the initial harassment through the final resolution. We'll need copies of that footage for evidence. Of course. But detective, I want to make sure something gets included in your report. Zoe's voice took on the passionate intensity of someone who'd witnessed something profound. What Steven Seagal did here, it wasn't just stopping a crime. It was showing everyone a different way to handle conflict. A better way. Kowalski nodded diplomatically, but his focus was on gathering facts, not philosophical interpretations. A black SUV pulled up to the curb, and Steven's manager, David Chun, emerged looking harried. He'd been monitoring social media and had driven straight from his office when #Steven Seagal started trending worldwide. Steven, Chun said, slightly out of breath, we need to talk. The story's everywhere. TMZ, CNN, international outlets. Your phone's been ringing nonstop. Steven's expression didn't change. Let them ring. This is huge. This is the best publicity you've had in years. We need to control the narrative, set up interviews, maybe a press conference. No, Steven said firmly. This isn't about publicity. This is about a young man who needed help. Chun looked around at the cameras, the reporters, the growing crowd of onlookers. Steven, with respect, this is about a lot more than that now. This is about your career, your image, your brand. My brand, Steven said quietly, is who I am when nobody's watching. Today, everybody was watching, but that doesn't change anything. Officer Santos had been working crowd control, but she approached Kowalski with a concern. Detective, we've got more media arriving every minute. This is going to become a public safety issue if we don't wrap it up soon. Kowalski nodded and turned to Tyrell, who had been standing quietly beside Steven throughout the media arrival. Mr. Monroe, I need you to come to the station to give a formal statement. And despite what you've said about waiving your rights, I'm going to insist you speak with a public defender. Will I be arrested? Tyrell asked, his voice small. That depends on several factors, including the district attorney's decision about charges. But given the circumstances and the victim's statements, you'll likely be released on your own recognizance pending further review. Tyrell looked at Stephen, seeking reassurance. You said you'd help me get counseling. I meant it, Stephen replied. I'll be in touch with your public defender to arrange everything we discussed. As Tyrell was led toward a patrol car, not in handcuffs, but under police supervision, the media pressed closer. Questions were shouted from multiple directions. Mr. Seagal, how does it feel to be a real-life hero? Was this a publicity stunt? Are you considering a return to action movies? What would you say to critics who claim this was staged? Stephen ignored them all, instead approaching Zoe, who was still recording. Turn off the camera for a moment, he said gently. She complied, lowering the device. What you captured today is important, he told her. But remember that the real story isn't about me. It's about the choice everyone has to make, whether to respond to pain with more pain or to break the cycle. Can I quote you on that? Stephen smiled slightly. You can quote me on this. Today a young man learned that he's stronger than his worst impulses. That's the only story that matters. As the police cars pulled away and the immediate crisis passed, the media attention was just beginning. The footage was already spreading across every platform, being analyzed and debated by millions of viewers around the world. But for those who had witnessed it firsthand, Dice, Marco, Mrs. Patel, Rosa, and especially Zoe, the real story wasn't about viral fame or celebrity intervention. It was about the moment when a community saw what was possible when someone chose compassion over conquest, when strength was used to heal rather than harm. The cameras would eventually leave, the hashtags would eventually fade, but the lesson would remain. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to use your power to destroy. 3 days after the incident on Chicago's River North, the internet was still burning with commentary, analysis, and debate. The hashtag Steven Seagal Street had generated over 50 million impressions across all platforms. Frame-by-frame breakdowns of Steven's Aikido techniques filled YouTube channels. Memes of Milo the Pitbull trying to intervene had become a symbol of everyday heroism. The incident had transcended viral moment to become a cultural touchstone. In his cramped studio apartment in Logan Square, Darnell Yates stared at his laptop screen, cursor blinking in the empty document that would become the most important piece of writing in his career. As a freelance blogger covering Chicago street culture, he'd covered gang violence, police brutality, and community activism. But this story demanded something different, a deeper exploration of what had really happened when cameras stopped rolling. His fingers found the keys. The real story of what happened on State Street isn't about Steven Seagal's Aikido mastery or Tyrell Monroe's internet infamy. It's about the moment when a community chose to witness transformation instead of destruction, when strength revealed itself not in the ability to dominate, but in the courage to heal. Darnell paused, remembering his own footage of the incident. He'd been grabbing lunch from Dice's cart when the confrontation began, had captured the entire sequence from his position near the coffee stand. But unlike the viral clips focusing on the dramatic takedown, his footage showed something else. The faces of the bystanders, the moment when a crowd of strangers became a community united by shared witness to something profound. His phone buzzed with a text from his editor at the Chicago Reader. Whatever you're writing about the Seagal thing, we want it. Front page, 3,000 words, deadline tomorrow. Meanwhile, at Chicago Police Headquarters, Officer Lena O'Connor was presenting the incident footage to a room full of fellow officers during their monthly training session on de-escalation techniques. The conference room was packed beyond capacity, with officers standing along the walls to watch the video evidence. What you're seeing here, O'Connor explained as Steven's calm redirection of Tyrell's first punch played on the screen, is textbook de-escalation. No aggressive posturing, no escalating language, no attempt to dominate or humiliate the aggressor. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez raised his hand. But what about officer safety? If that was one of us instead of a martial arts expert, how do we apply these principles without getting stabbed? Good question, O'Connor replied, pausing the video. The principles remain the same even if our training is different. Notice how Seagal's positioning never gives the suspect an advantage. His hands are visible, his stance is balanced, his voice remains calm. These are techniques we can all learn and apply. The video continued to Stephen's gentle but firm restraint of Tyrell after disarming him. Several officers leaned forward, studying the hold. "He's not trying to cause pain," observed Officer Janet Kim. "He's controlling the situation without escalating force." "Exactly," O'Connor confirmed. "And look at the result. Complete confession, voluntary cooperation, and a suspect who actually wants to rehabilitate rather than resist the system." In another part of the city, inside the Cook County Jail, Tyrell Monroe sat on the edge of his narrow bunk, watching his own viral infamy play out on the small television mounted in the common area. The other inmates had initially approached him with a mixture of curiosity and mockery, some impressed by his internet fame, others amused by his spectacular humiliation. "Yo, T-Rex," called out Marcus Williams, a repeat offender who'd become something of a jailhouse philosopher during his multiple incarcerations. "You watching yourself get schooled again?" Tyrell didn't respond immediately. The man on the screen seemed like a stranger to him now, angry, desperate, performing cruelty for an audience that he was beginning to understand had never really cared about him as a person. "You know what's crazy?" Tyrell said finally, his voice thoughtful. "I spent 3 years building up this persona, this character that people either loved or hated. But nobody knew who I really was. Hell, I didn't know who I really was." Marcus sat down beside him on the bench. "And now? Now I'm nobody," Tyrell admitted. "Lost my apartment, lost my sponsors, lost my platform. But for the first time in years, I'm not performing. I'm just me. And I'm trying to figure out who that is." The footage on the television had shifted to the moment where Stephen offered to pay for Tyrell's counseling. Several inmates had stopped their card games and conversations to watch. "That dude could have ended you," observed Carlos, a young gang member awaiting trial. "Could have let the system destroy you. Why you think he didn't?" Tyrell considered the question he'd been asking himself for days. "I think he saw something in me that I'd forgotten was there. Something worth saving." His court-appointed attorney had arranged for his release on recognizance the following day, with conditions including mandatory counseling and community service. Steven Seagal had been true to his word. Funding had been arranged for a comprehensive rehabilitation program that addressed anger management, trauma therapy, and career counseling. Across town in her small apartment near DePaul University, Zoe Martinez was editing her documentary footage, but the project had evolved far beyond her original concept. What had started as a simple exploration of immigrant street vendors had become something much more complex, an examination of power, vulnerability, and the possibility of redemption. Her editor timeline showed multiple angles of the incident: her own handheld footage from the victim's perspective, Dice's shaky phone recording, Marco's artistic side view, and even security camera footage from nearby businesses that had been shared with her. But the most powerful moments weren't the dramatic confrontation. They were the quiet conversations afterward, the community coming together to process what they'd witnessed. She'd conducted follow-up interviews with everyone involved. Mrs. Patel had spoken eloquently about the difference between power used to harm and power used to protect. Rosa, the jewelry vendor, had shared her own experiences with street harassment and how Stephen's intervention had changed her perspective on seeking help. Even Milo the pit bull had become a subject of analysis. Animal behaviorists had reached out to discuss how dogs respond to human conflict and resolution. Her phone rang, interrupting her editing session. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "Hello, Ms. Martinez? This is David Chun, Steven Seagal's manager. Steven would like to meet with you about your documentary." An hour later, Zoe found herself in a small cafe in Lincoln Park, sitting across from the man who had literally changed her life. Stephen looked exactly as calm and centered as he had during the incident, wearing simple clothes and drinking green tea. "I wanted to thank you," he said without preamble, "for continuing to tell the real story." "What do you mean?" "Most of the media coverage has focused on the spectacle, the fight, the takedown, the celebrity angle. But your footage captures something more important. It shows the moment when a community chooses healing over harm." Zoe nodded, pulling out her camera. "Do you mind if I record this?" "Actually, I'd prefer if you didn't. What I want to share with you isn't for public consumption. It's for you to understand the responsibility that comes with this story." She set the camera aside, giving him her full attention. 20 years ago, I was involved in similar situations, Stephen continued. Street confrontations where I used force to stop violence. But I always walked away feeling empty, feeling like I'd missed an opportunity to actually solve something instead of just ending it. What changed? I started studying Aikido not just as a martial art, but as a philosophy. The founder, Morihei Ueshiba, taught that the highest level of martial arts is to stop conflict before it becomes violence, to transform an attacker into a friend. Stephen's voice carried the weight of years of practice and reflection. What happened with Tyrell wasn't about my skill or training. It was about recognizing that beneath his aggression was a human being who'd been hurt and was hurting others as a result. And now, Zoe asked, what happens to him now? Now he faces the hardest fight of his life, the fight to become who he's meant to be instead of who his pain told him he was. And our job as a community is to support that transformation instead of just punishing the mistakes. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the late afternoon sun filter through the cafe windows. Your documentary has the power to change how people think about conflict resolution, Stephen said finally, to show that there's another way besides violence and vengeance. But only if you're willing to tell the complete truth, not just about what happened, but about what it means. Zoe felt the weight of that responsibility settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just a film school project anymore. It was a chance to contribute to a conversation about healing, about justice, about the possibility of transformation even in the darkest moments. I won't let you down, she said. Stephen smiled, the first truly relaxed expression she'd seen from him. You already haven't. The fact that you're asking these questions, that you're thinking beyond the spectacle, that tells me you understand what's really at stake here. As they parted ways, Zoe felt a clarity about her project that had been missing before. This wasn't just the story of one incident on one street. It was a template for how communities could respond to violence with wisdom instead of fear, how individuals could choose growth over destruction, how society could embrace the possibility that people could change. The viral moment would fade, but the lessons would endure. And she would make sure of that. 6 months after the incident that would forever be remembered as the River North intervention, Zoe Martinez stood in the back of a packed auditorium at the Chicago Cultural Center, watching her documentary premiere to an audience that included many of the people who had lived it firsthand. Strength, a Chicago story, had evolved far beyond its original scope. What began as a simple exploration of immigrant entrepreneurs had become a profound meditation on power, community, and the possibility of transformation. The film had already been accepted to Sundance and was being courted by streaming platforms. But tonight's screening was special. It was for the neighborhood, for the people who had witnessed history and helped shape its meaning. In the front row sat Steven Seagal, wearing the same understated clothing he'd worn that day on State Street. Beside him sat Tyrell, Monroe, looking healthier and more centered than anyone had seen him in years. The months of therapy, community service, and soul-searching had fundamentally changed him, stripping away the performative aggression to reveal someone genuinely committed to making amends. Dice had closed his cart early to attend, Milo lying peacefully at his feet. The dog had become something of a local celebrity, with people stopping by the cart specifically to meet the dog who tried to help. Dice had embraced his new role as neighborhood storyteller, sharing the lessons of that day with anyone willing to listen. Mrs. Patel sat with Rosa, the jewelry vendor, both women wearing traditional dress for the special occasion. They had become close friends in the months following the incident, with Mrs. Patel helping Rosa expand her business and Rosa teaching Mrs. Patel's grandchildren about Mexican culture. Marco Lee had been commissioned to create a mural depicting the incident on the wall of the building where it occurred. His artistic interpretation focused not on the confrontation but on the community that emerged from it, dozens of faces representing the witnesses who chose to engage rather than just observe. As the lights dimmed and the film began, Zoe felt the nervous excitement of every filmmaker at a premiere. But this was different. These weren't critics or industry professionals. These were the people whose lives had been changed by what they'd experienced together. The documentary opened with Stephen's voice over images of the bustling street. Real power isn't about what you can break. It's about what you can heal. It's about choosing, in the moment when everything hangs in the balance, to be someone who builds bridges instead of walls. The film unfolded in chapters, each focusing on a different perspective of the incident. Dice's chapter, The Witness, explored how bystanders could become participants in community healing. Mrs. Patel's segment, The Nurturer, examined how communities care for their vulnerable members. Rose's chapter, The Survivor, looked at how victims of harassment could reclaim their power through collective support. But it was Tyrell's chapter, The Transformation, that brought tears to eyes throughout the auditorium. The film followed his journey from internet provocateur to community volunteer, including footage of him working at a homeless shelter, attending therapy sessions, and speaking to young people about the dangers of seeking validation through cruelty. I spent years trying to prove I was strong by making other people feel weak, Tyrell said in his interview segments. But real strength, the kind Stephen showed me, comes from lifting people up, not tearing them down. The climax of the film wasn't the physical confrontation, but the moment afterward, when the community chose restorative justice over punitive measures. Officer O'Connor appeared in the film to discuss how the incident had changed police training protocols, emphasizing de-escalation techniques based on Aikido principles. What we learned that day, O'Connor said in her interview, is that sometimes the most effective law enforcement isn't about enforcement at all. It's about understanding that behind every act of aggression is a human being who needs help more than punishment. The film's final chapter, The Ripple Effect, showed how the incident had spread beyond Chicago. Police departments around the country were incorporating Stephen's techniques into their training programs. Community organizations were using the story to discuss conflict resolution. Schools were teaching students about the difference between power and strength. But perhaps most importantly, the film showed how the neighborhood itself had changed. Street vendors reported feeling safer, knowing their community would stand up for them. Young people like Tyrell were finding mentorship through programs inspired by Stephen's intervention. The incident had created a template for how communities could respond to violence with wisdom instead of fear. As the credits rolled and the lights came up, the applause was thunderous. But Stephen remained seated, his focus on Tyrell, who was wiping tears from his eyes. "You okay?" Stephen asked quietly. "Yeah," Tyrell said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's just seeing it all laid out like that, seeing how many people were affected. I had no idea how big this thing really was." "It's not about the size," Stephen replied. "It's about the truth. And the truth is that people can change, communities can heal, and sometimes the worst moments in our lives become the doorway to the best versions of ourselves." During the Q&A session that followed, questions came from all corners of the community. A young teacher asked about implementing conflict resolution programs in schools. A police officer wanted to know more about Aikido training for law enforcement. A social worker inquired about replicating the restorative justice model used in Tyrell's case. But it was a question from a teenager in the back that brought the evening full circle. "Mr. Monroe, what would you say to someone who's making the same mistakes you made?" Tyrell stood up slowly, looking out at the audience filled with people who had witnessed his transformation. "I'd say that the person you think you have to be to survive, that angry, aggressive person who hurts others to feel powerful, that person isn't your real self. That's just pain wearing a mask." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "The hardest thing I ever did was take off that mask and face the hurt underneath. But when I did, I found out that there were people willing to help me heal instead of just punish me for being broken." He looked at Stephen, then at Zoe, then at the faces throughout the audience. "And I found out that the real me, the me that existed before all the pain, was someone worth saving. Someone capable of helping instead of hurting. Someone who could be part of the solution instead of part of the problem." The applause that followed was different from the earlier ovation. Deeper, more personal, acknowledging not just artistic achievement, but human transformation. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, small conversations sparked throughout the auditorium. Plans were made for community programs. Contact information was exchanged between social workers and former offenders. Teachers talked with police officers about bringing conflict resolution into classrooms. Outside the cultural center, the same streets where the incident had occurred buzzed with activity. Dice's cart was back in its familiar spot, Milo greeting regular customers who'd become friends. Mrs. Patel's flower stall bloomed with late summer arrangements. Rose's jewelry business had expanded to include pieces inspired by that day. Silver pendants shaped like bridges, earrings that caught the light like hope. Stephen stood at the edge of the small crowd, watching the interactions with quiet satisfaction. This was what success looked like. Not movie tickets or box office numbers, but a community that had learned to see conflict as an opportunity for connection rather than destruction. Zoe approached him, her camera for once left behind. "So what's next?" she asked. "Next?" Stephen smiled. "Next we keep doing the work. Teaching, learning, helping people understand that they're stronger than their worst impulses. The cameras will move on to other stories, but the work continues." He gestured toward Tyrell, who was deep in conversation with a group of young people, sharing his story with the kind of raw honesty that could only come from someone who'd truly faced himself. "That young man will reach people I never could," Stephen said. "His journey from online provocateur to community healer. That's going to inspire others who think they're too far gone to change." As if sensing he was being discussed, Tyrell looked over and waved. Stephen waved back, the simple gesture carrying the weight of mentorship, friendship, and shared commitment to something larger than themselves. The street was quieting as the evening grew late, but the energy of transformation lingered in the air. Street lamps illuminated the mural Marco had painted, its faces reflecting the community that had emerged from a moment of crisis. At the center of the mural, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, was a small figure of a dog, Milo, the pit bull who had tried to help, representing the instinct toward protection and care that exists in all living beings when given the chance to flourish. The incident on State Street was over, but its legacy would continue. In the police officers trained in de-escalation techniques, in the young people who learned that strength meant protecting rather than dominating, in the community members who discovered that their worst moments could become catalysts for their best selves. The cameras had captured a fight, but the people who lived it had created something much more powerful. Proof that transformation was possible, that communities could heal, and that sometimes the most profound victories happened, not when someone was defeated, but when they were saved from defeating themselves. As Zoe walked home through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, she realized that her documentary had done more than tell a story. It had become part of the story itself, contributing to the ongoing narrative of how people choose to treat each other when they think no one is watching. But someone is always watching. And more importantly, someone is always capable of choosing to be better than they were the moment before. The story continued, one choice at a time, one person at a time, one community at a time. And it would never really end. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.